Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are doing well as we enter, I guess it's the sixth week of our exile from campus. But I hope you are hanging in there. Know that I'm praying for you. Lots of people at SBU are praying for you, and I hope you're doing as well as you can possibly doing under these weird circumstances. But I'm back here again today with a little more video lecture action, and we're building directly off of our last video that we posted, which was on the Romantic movement in America. And so, coming right alongside those changes in literature and philosophy, we see once again another revival of traditional Orthodox historic Christianity. This spans just about the first half of the 19th century, and historians often call it the Second Great Awakening. Now, earlier in the course, when we talked about the First Great Awakening, we discussed the idea of religious revival. And what do we mean when we talk about religious revival? Are we talking about something that's internal? Are we talking about a person's, own spiritual life, that they're seeking after God or seeking salvation or asking questions of a spiritual nature? Or are we talking about something that's institutional and organizational? Is this about church growth and church planting? And the answer is yes. And when we talk about these revivals or these awakenings in American society, it's playing out on both levels. This is about individuals who find themselves drawn into asking spiritual questions, or maybe on a personal spiritual quest of their own. And it's also about institutional growth as well in the major Christian denominations in America. So I guess to set the stage, we need to think back to our earlier lectures on intellectual life in America in the 1700s. And we talked a lot about the growth of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, you'll remember, was not necessarily terribly friendly to traditional Christianity. There was a strong anti-clerical bent to it. Enlightenment thinkers distrust organized religion. They distrust the nature of faith. Faith is an obstacle to reason. Therefore, faith needs to be opposed if we're striving towards a more rational society. By the end of the 1700s, you begin to see that Enlightenment rationalism making its way deeper and deeper into some corners of the church. So, for instance, you begin to see denominations emerge by the end of the 1700s, like the Unitarians, who seek what they believe is a more rational view about the nature of God. Really kind of pushing back against the idea of the Trinity, which they don't think makes any mathematical sense. 3 does not equal 1 and 1 does not equal 3. Therefore, they kind of insist on the oneness of God. That's where they get the name Unitarians, because they emphasize the unity of God. Quickest way to do that is usually to demote Jesus down to prophet or teacher, and then it's easier to see God sort of one cohesive being. Universalists are also making inroads. Universalists, that name refers to their opinion about salvation, that salvation is universal, that everyone is saved in the end, that God would be too merciful to condemn anyone to hell. And so those two denominations very much are reflecting some of the sensibilities of the Enlightenment. So if you had been an American in 1800, you might be forgiven for thinking that sort of rational, Enlightenment-infused religion was going to be the trend of the future. But in fact, in 1800, America is on the very cusp of a revival of traditional, historic, Orthodox Christianity. In fact, it's going to be that more historic version of the faith that's about to make a big surge. You might notice stirrings of this as far back as the 1790s. In the 1790s, late part of that decade, on the campus of Yale University, Yale is under the leadership of Timothy Dwight, its president, and Dwight launches a preaching series on campus, sort of reasserting traditional Calvinism on that campus. So pushing back against some of this Enlightenment style thinking, arguing that the Calvinistic interpretation of Scripture is the proper one. And we see this revival on the campus. A lot of students are reporting conversion experiences. Many of them graduate from campus and fan out into the larger community or across the state of Connecticut in order to preach their own revivals. So revivalism kind of reverberating out from Yale in the 1790s. And we see that process accelerate as we enter into the 19th century. Now, one of the most important manifestations of revivalism early in the Second Great Awakening is going to be what we call the camp meeting. Okay, camp meetings generally take place out on the frontier. Now, for religious figures early in this century, there is a sense that they've kind of failed when it comes to bringing the gospel to frontier areas. And I'm not even talking about Native American missions. That's an entirely different topic. But just in terms of the settlers and the pioneers, so they're going way out into the West. They're spreading out over a vast geographic location, and churches have not done a good job keeping up with that. A lot of those people, whatever their personal beliefs are, they may well be Christians, but they don't have access to a church just for geographic reasons. The closest church would be too far away. So a lot of denominations in the early 19th century have come up with this tactic known as the camp meeting. And this is a way to reach these frontier people with the gospel and do it by utilizing the resources that they already have. So what we would see in a camp meeting would be they would choose a location. Okay, they would choose a central location somewhere out on the frontier. They would almost always choose midsummer. That was the one time that a farmer might be able to get away. So it's too cold to travel in the winter. You got to plant in the spring, you got to harvest in the fall. So midsummer is going to be your best time for doing this. And you are going to spread the word that you are bringing in ministers, pastors, and that you're going to have an extended series of religious meetings out here on the frontier. And it's sort of a build it and they'll come attitude. You're hoping that once you make this announcement that this is going to be so attractive to the people who live in that region that they're actually going to pack their belongings, they're going to come, they're going to camp out at this central location, and they might stay for a few days, maybe they'll stay for a couple weeks because they want to hear preaching, because they want to engage in singing and what we might call today praise and worship activities. And very importantly is communion. Almost everything else laity can take care of. A layman can get up and speak on Sunday morning. You know, you can sing without a pastor, but in most denominations you have to be ordained to offer the sacraments. So the Lord's Supper is a really important drawing card to these camp meetings. So this happens on many occasions, but the most famous camp meeting in American religious history takes place at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in the year 1801. So let me talk about the Cane Ridge revival for a few moments and how it makes such a big impact here early in the Second Great Awakening. So Cane Ridge revival here takes place in 1801 out in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. It is a cooperative venture between the three biggest Protestant denominations in that area, Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterians. The Cane Ridge revival draws a crowd of about 25,000 people. This is a big crowd for a place that really is off in the boonies. The nearest community to Cane Ridge is Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky in 1801, population 2,000. And you got 25,000 people cramming in to this revival. So people are coming from a fairly long distance away. People are coming from as far as 100 miles away to participate in the Cane Ridge revival. So as I said, it's interdenominational, at least in terms of Protestants. It also draws both black and white worshipers. I think the racial dynamics are interesting here in Cane Ridge. because Kentucky is a slave state in 1801, and you would not necessarily expect black people and white people to worship at the same event. You would not necessarily expect black and white preachers to be at this same event, but yet they were. And I'm not making a claim that this is integrated and the racial groups are completely intermixed, okay? But they are side by side in the same proximity. Okay, there may have been, meetings that were predominantly meant for one group or another, but still, in a slave state in 1801, I think it is interesting that there was a sense that there was space for both black Christians and white Christians to be here. Now, from all the reports, Cane Ridge was pretty awe-inspiring. It must have been a very intense sort of experience. So just imagine for a few minutes, okay? You're camping out in this very rural location. 25,000 people packed in. These are noisy, tough, profane frontiersmen. They're crowded together listening to fire and brimstone preachers. Okay, these preachers are up there. They are laying it on the line. They're not tiptoeing around. The preaching is going to be very intense. And then after the sermons, after the singing, you go back to your campsite. Imagine the campfires as far as the eye can see. Imagine the social dimensions of Cane Ridge. Okay, these are people who live fairly isolated lives. They see only their families on a day-to-day basis, and suddenly crowded in with old friends and strangers, and the opportunity to get to know new people. So socially, this must have been overwhelming as well. Now, the revival apparently sees tremendous results. An enormous conversion rate is reported here at Cane Ridge. So lots of people believe they're having conversion experiences here. And there's also a little bit of weirdness that goes on at Cane Ridge. You'll remember that back in the First Great Awakening had been a critique of revivalism, that there are just these odd psychological reactions sometimes. People getting up and running around uncontrollably during services, bursting out into uncontrollable laughter, dancing, falling to the floor, jerking around, appearing to have some sort of seizure. And then my personal favorite was always the people who fell down on all fours and started barking, which apparently happened often enough, was actually given a name. If you did that, you were treeing the devil, much like a hunting dog would tree some sort of animal, a raccoon or an opossum. And they call that treeing the devil. So apparently, there were a good many people who felt the Holy Spirit was leading them to bark. Not anything I've ever done, but again, it makes the revival seem more intense, but also opens the door for criticism of the revival as well. Well, as I said, the Cane Ridge revival, from people who were there, apparently makes a big impact. So how can historians judge the impact of Cane Ridge 200 years later, 220 years later? Is there any way we can do that? Because we can't interview the people. We can't go back and ask, hey, what did God do in your life at Cane Ridge? What can historians tell after the fact? Well, we can sort of track numbers. We can track church growth trends in the region, and many historians have done that. So they've taken Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and drawn sort of a 100-mile circle around Cane Ridge, because that's going to be where most of the people at that revival came from. And so do we notice anything about church growth in this region in the years after Cane Ridge? And what we do see is a pretty big explosion in church growth here. Okay, so, what the numbers tell us is that this was not a short-lived experience. The people who were at Cane Ridge apparently took on a new interest in the church, in their spiritual lives, that lasted over several years and led them to building up the church as an institution in this area of Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, kind of the area where the Cane Ridge attendees were drawn from. Well, revivals like Cane Ridge are eventually going to open the door for one of the most famous revivalists of the early 19th century. And his name is Charles Grandison Finney. Okay, a Presbyterian pastor, but his fame and his reputation go far beyond the Presbyterian Church. He is one in a series of celebrity evangelists, superstar evangelists that come across the American landscape every 2 or 3 generations. Okay, beginning with George Whitefield, who we talked about earlier in the class. He had that kind of reputation. Then there's Finney. You get Dwight L. Moody in the late 19th century, and you get Billy Graham in the late 20th century. And all of these are going to be leaders that are they're not just leaders in their own denomination. They are recognized as leaders for all Christians. Okay, Billy Graham was a Southern Baptist, but yet his reputation was much larger than that during his ministry. So Finney's a Presbyterian, but yet Finney's reputation is as a larger Christian leader during this time period. So Finney has an interesting background. He was not always a religious individual. He was born in upstate New York into a sort of irreligious family. You know, faith was not a big concern for him growing up. As a young man, he becomes a lawyer. He kind of laughs at revivalism, doesn't take it very seriously, but yet it's not too long until he himself is converted to Christianity, and ironically, then feels the call himself to become an evangelist, okay, which he will do. By 1821, Finney is telling people about his new career path, but he really doesn't see it as a dramatic transition from being a lawyer to being a pastor. He tells people simply that he received his retainer from God. Retainer is the down payment you give a lawyer to argue a case. So for Finney, he's just now arguing the case of God instead of arguing human cases in court. So let me talk about a few major themes in Finney's ministry, because he is a pretty big deal here in the early 19th century. So the major themes of Charles Finney. Okay. First of all, like many of the important figures here in the Second Great Awakening, Finney emphasizes free will. Now, in the First Great Awakening, almost all the major players were Calvinists. Okay, their method of salvation was through divine predestination. Okay, that God had chosen certain people to extend the gift of salvation for, and it doesn't matter. This happens before you're born. It doesn't matter what you do. It's an exercise in divine omnipotence. But in the Second Great Awakening, we begin to see more key players embrace an Arminian or a free will theology in various flavors. Certainly, Finney is an example of this, even though he's a Presbyterian. And Presbyterians are generally Calvinistic during this time period. Finney abandons Calvinism. Okay, he argues that a higher spiritual life is available for anyone who seeks it. Secondly, Finney emphasizes the idea of entire sanctification. There is in his ministry an increasing emphasis on perfectionism. Okay, what happens to an individual after they are saved and becomes a Christian? Well, Finney expects that sin is going to lose its grip over your life. And for Finney, and we'll see this opens him up for some criticism, for Finney, victory over sin is pretty much an act of human will. His belief is that sin is pretty much a voluntary act. Sin is just something you decide to do. And if it's something you decide to do, it's avoidable. You can decide not to sin. And so with that kind of very simple formulation, Finney can argue that holiness is then a human possibility. If you choose to do right and you choose to avoid sin, eventually you will become a more holy and righteous and godly person. So, certainly one way to approach this. Finney is also a master of putting together revivals. Okay, and he has a set of strategies that he utilizes, and many of them are still utilized by evangelists today, known as the new measures. So, what do you need to do once you've decided to preach a revival? What can you do? What measures can you put into place to make sure that you get the most bang for your buck? To make sure that your preaching is effective, to increase the harvest, to increase the number of people who respond to your preaching and want to have faith and want to come to salvation. So, Finney thinks a lot about these issues. Okay. So, what are some of the characteristics that he employs here? What are some of these new measures? Okay, well, part of it is his preaching style. Okay, Finney's sermons are in a very tough and direct style. And Finney also has physical presence behind the pulpit as well. If you ever go out and Google a picture of Charles Finney, and even in black and white photography, he has these piercing blue eyes. I mean, in any picture of Finney, just his eyes are like laser beams coming out at you. So it must have been intimidating to hear him preaching to begin with. And then he's very direct, kind of an in-your-face style. He'll call you out by name in a service. Okay, if you're a notorious sinner and you're there, if you're an opponent of his revival, he might very well mention you by name. So there's a confrontational element to this. He also believes, when you're thinking about a revival, what stops people? You're being presented with the gospel, the offer of being reconciled to God, the offer of living forever in heaven. Why on earth would you turn that down? Why on earth would you leave that church without getting right with God? And Finney comes to the conclusion, well, there's a certain loneliness about the decision. So you're in church and you're hearing the preaching, and you're wondering, you feel you're alone. You feel alone with God. There may be a crowd, but you feel like you're one-on-one with God. It's not a comfortable feeling. God's dealing with you about your sin, and you just want to get to the door. You just want to get out for some fresh air. And Finney kind of concludes that sense of isolation that maybe plays into this. So what if we can make conversion a more communal experience? And so Finney begins to add this innovation where he calls people forward at the end of the service. Essentially an altar call, although they would probably use the front pew during Finney's crusades. But he would invite people up to what he called the anxious bench, that front pew in the church. And so, first of all, this encouraged people to take that first step, okay, to stand up and walk down that aisle. Finney believes if you're not willing to walk down that aisle, you're probably not serious about conversion at this point. But once you make that first step, there are going to be other believers who meet you up there at the anxious bench. They're going to be able to pray with you and sort of create a sense of community and family as you wrestle with this moment of conversion in your life. And of course, I would imagine that many of you who have a background in church have been to a service with an altar call at the end, and that's certainly something that Charles Finney very much popularized during his ministry. He also wonders how you get people in the front door. Is it okay to advertise a church service, or is that beneath the dignity of the church? Finney thinks it's okay to advertise. Yeah, absolutely. Make up flyers, put up posters around town. Whatever it takes to get people in the front door, that's going to be okay. Finney also wonders about entertainment in these revivals. He begins to experiment with the use of music as a drawing card. Okay, what if we have an entertainer or a singer who comes and gives a performance? Is that legitimate? Because if you come for the music, you're probably going to stay for the sermon. So you're going to hear this singer that you like, and then you're probably going to stay and hear this gospel presentation. And is that a bait and switch? Finney doesn't think so. It's fine, and he becomes one of the first preachers sort of very seriously cultivate a musical ministry as well, understanding that is kind of a drawing card that will get people into the church here. So showmanship, advertising, it's all fair game as far as Finney is concerned. To his critics, he would just simply say, well, you can criticize my methods, but they very much work. For instance, in 1839, Finney preaches a 6-month revival in Rochester, New York. And according to his own statistics, he gets about 100,000 conversions here. So he would simply say that you can be critical, but yet people are talking about experiencing conversion. People are coming out of here saying that they have become Christians. They've given their lives to God. So Finney would argue, that sort of justifies unconventional methods. Number four. Fourth thing we should understand about Finney, okay, is that he also is very interested in social action. So for most evangelicals during the Second Great Awakening, there are two aspects of your Christian life that you ought to be cultivating. So there's personal piety. So you need to have a close relationship with God. You need to immerse yourself in the Word. You need to have a good prayer life. But there's also this whole social domain as well, because it matters how you treat other people. It matters how you love your neighbor in Christianity. And so Finney, and again, many other evangelicals in the early 19th century see that as very important. One place where Finney really drives home the social points is at an institution of higher education that he founds in Ohio known as Oberlin College. And at various points, Finney serves as president of Oberlin and as a professor of theology. And Oberlin does things quite a bit differently than most colleges and universities in America in the early 1800s. First of all, they are coeducational. Men and women study side by side at Oberlin. Okay, African Americans are admitted to Oberlin and study alongside white students as well. So, sex barriers, male-female barriers fall by the wayside. Racial barriers fall by the wayside here at Oberlin. It's also a hotbed of abolitionism. So Finney is very anti-slavery and is pretty candid about his anti-slavery feelings. So if you want a college experience where you're talking about Christianity and how Christianity might lead you to oppose slavery, then Oberlin might be a place that you would end up. And it is one of those places where where abolitionism is openly discussed, and people who go on to be leaders in that movement sometimes have formative experiences at Oberlin. So the social action dimension is really important to Finney. Okay. And then finally, we should probably mention that Finney is also a controversial figure during his own day and today. If you doubt me, Google a phrase like Charles Finney heresy, and you're still going to come up with quite a few hits. A lot of evangelicals today do look back and they find some shortcomings here in Finney's theology, touching on a lot of issues: original sin, divine grace, divine sovereignty, the nature of the atonement. All of these things have been criticized about Finney's teachings, and again, he's probably, as influential as he is in American religious history, he's probably not a great example of an early 19th century Presbyterian. Okay, he essentially believes, for instance, he believes salvation to be an act of the human will. Okay, you decide whether to be saved, and he's never very clear over whether God's grace plays much of a role. Now, for Calvinists, salvation is entirely about God's grace. Through God's grace, he chooses the elect and enables them to come into salvation, enables them to have faith. But even for other free will theologians, we'll talk in the future about John Wesley a bit, there's much more of a role for grace in salvation. But Finney thinks it's pretty much a decision you make. And a lot of Christians might take issue with that. Finney would argue that the best evidence of salvation is works. Okay, it matters a whole lot how you act and what you do and what you don't do after you're saved. Ongoing sin in your life is evidence that a person is not really saved. And Finney would argue that you got to be saved from sin before you are saved from hell. He sees works as a really important evidence of salvation, and he has kind of a different views on the atonement. Does not necessarily believe that Christ took on the punishment for sin for every person in the human race when he died on the cross. Doesn't necessarily go along with that as some theologians would. So that's occasioned some criticism as well. He flirts with a few unorthodox opinions during his career, but that doesn't stop him from probably being the preeminent name in American Christianity during this time period. So I have more to say, but I think I'm going to divide this actually into two lectures here so that none of them run too long. I'm already at 30 minutes. So more to come on the Second Great Awakening. Take care, guys.